Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 759, and today is February 17th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Today's show might be on the shorter side. Again, I'm still trying to get fully over this cold. I'm feeling pretty much all better, but I do get a cough if I talk a lot. So if the cough gets too bad, I will probably wrap it up. But everybody, thanks so much for tuning in and not only supporting this show, but also the Libertarian Institute, which is particularly important this next week as we are holding our fundraiser. So head on over to the Libertarian Institute, make a contribution. We got some great kit bats that we're offering. And of course, the great kit bats that we offer every day with all the great content that we put out. Just myself through the Institute, you get this show at least 3 times a week, as well as I do the Kyle Anzalone show twice a week. There is the daily news roundup that I put out, news articles that I write every day, typically at least 2 of them. Those are Monday morning through Friday morning. And then also the daily newsletter that I send out to the Libertarian Institute email list. So subscribe to all that. Make sure you're following everything that you can. I'm on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. And if you can, if you got the funds, consider donating to the Libertarian Institute. Help us continue to fight against the tyranny of the state. So on today's show, we're starting off with U.S. and Russian officials to hold talks in Saudi Arabia next week. Dave DeCamp wrote this one for antiwar.com on February 16th. He says, top Trump administration officials are set to travel to Saudi Arabia next week to hold talks with Russian officials to discuss bringing the war in Ukraine to an end, multiple media outlets reported on Sunday. The delegation is expected to include Secretary of State Marco Rubio, that's bad news, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, that's probably bad news as well, and Steve Witkoff, Trump's Middle East envoy, which may be the positive piece of that puzzle. He was the one who went to Russia to pick up Mark Fogel, the American who was detained there for bringing a little bit of marijuana into Russia, and then also was the one who pressured Netanyahu to take the initial Gaza ceasefire deal. So, I mean, it's not that I think Steve Witkoff is maybe some great diplomat, but it's certainly better than anybody who was involved in the Biden administration, Rubio or Waltz. So Rubio spoke with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, in a phone call on Saturday, following up on President Trump's recent call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The State Department explained the Rubio-Lavrov call as the secretary reaffirmed President Trump's commitment to finding an end to the conflict in Ukraine. In addition, they discussed the opportunity to potentially work together on a number of other bilateral issues. Ukrainian officials said they were not involved in the talks or not invited to the talks in Saudi Arabia. Zelensky said in an interview that aired Sunday that he will never accept any decision between the U.S. and Russia about Ukraine if Ukrainian officials don't participate in the negotiations. One of the unfortunate things for Zelensky is that America not only being his greatest benefactor, but the United States effectively being the financial arm of the Ukrainian state means that even if he doesn't like the deal the U.S. and Russia come to, he's either going to have to comply with it or probably face worse consequences. So while it's still unclear of how the war will end, the Trump administration policy towards Russia is a dramatic shift from the Biden administration. After Russia invaded Ukraine, President Biden refused to speak with Putin despite acknowledging the risk of nuclear war was at its highest point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Secretary of State Blinken also refused to engage in any meaningful diplomacy with Lavrov, including only holding a brief discussion with him about a prisoner exchange after the invasion, but never any talks on the war. And this was by design, right? It wasn't that, Blinken called and they were willing to agree to the prisoner exchange, but just didn't want to talk about ending the war. It was U.S. policy that we wouldn't talk to Russia about ending the war. We would say nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, which meant that only Zelensky would decide when the war would end. And Zelensky would openly state that he was unwilling to let the war end unless all of Ukraine's territory was returned, even the Crimean Peninsula, and Ukraine was able to receive security guarantees from the West, just absolute non-starters from Moscow's perspective. All right, next up here. Report, Ukraine rejected deal to add half of its mineral wealth to the U.S. So, Ukrainian President Zelensky has rejected a proposal for the United States to take ownership of 50% of the rights to Ukraine's rare earth minerals and other natural resources, the Financial Times reported on Saturday. The report said the offer was made when U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent visited Ukraine last week. While Zelensky rejected the initial offer, he has expressed an openness to a rare earth deal with the U.S. and is reportedly working to negotiate a better deal. The White House National Security Council spokesman Brian Hughes said that by rejecting the U.S. proposal, Zelensky was being short-sighted about the excellent opportunity the Trump administration has presented to Ukraine. Zelensky's main demand for the deal is for robust security guarantees from the U.S. and Europe. A person familiar with the proposal delivered told Bessent that the Financial Times it only referenced the U.S. getting mineral access for past military assistance and didn't include any offer for U.S. support. So NBC's News reported that the Trump administration officials have suggested an openness to deploying U.S. troops to Ukraine to guard U.S.-owned natural resources if there is a peace deal with Russia, although Secretary of State Pete Hegseth has ruled out the idea of a U.S. deployment to the country. Russia also said it won't accept the presence of any foreign troops, saying peacekeepers could only be deployed under the mandate of the UN Security Council, which I'm guessing would mean that Russia would veto it unless the peacekeepers are from, if not a friendly country, certainly a more independent leading country. So friendly, I would think China. Independent leaning would be maybe India, South Africa, or Brazil, maybe another Latin American country. Those would be, I think, the countries that Russia may be open to having their peacekeepers. I'm guessing it certainly won't be American, European, or any Western countries. I've heard some people float Japan and South Korea. That also seems unlikely to me. Japan and Russia have territorial disputes, and while that's on Russia's eastern, not western border, I'm sure that Moscow is not going to be happy with Japanese troops in Ukraine. And additionally, South Korea has supported the Western war against Russia to a lesser degree than most other countries, but I would still guess that makes it a non-starter. Now, when we're talking about the talks, we have some very broad outlines that were put forward by National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. So I wrote this one up for the Institute on February 16th. Trump advisor gives 4 tenets of deal to end war in Ukraine. So National Security Advisor Mike Waltz discussed some of the core issues for President Donald Trump in the upcoming talks on ending the war in Ukraine. He did not confirm that Ukraine would be involved in the talks. So on Fox News Sunday, Waltz explained, Number 1, it has to be a permanent end to the war, not a temporary end to the war. Number 2, this can get ended on the battlefield. This has turned into a World War I style meat grinder of human beings. And certainly on these first 2 points, I think this is a positive. Now, accepting some kind of temporary ceasefire to facilitate negotiations could be helpful, but I do think that, as we've heard from Pete Hegseth as well, we don't want a Minsk III agreement, which would basically mean another ceasefire that has a long-term plan to eventually bring the war to a close. Situations like that just seem to, at least at best, frozen conflicts and not a real resolution. So I do think that's a good thing. And then recognizing that this isn't going to end on the battlefield, that Ukraine is never going to drive all Russian soldiers from Ukraine is important. Now, the point on this that I also wanted to bring up was just that I hope the American side realizes that the war could be ended on the battlefield in one way, and that's if the Ukrainian military collapses and then Ukraine is forced to negotiate at the table at the barrel of the Russian gun. I think in that way the war could essentially be won militarily by Russia, just not Ukraine. So number 3, according to Waltz, he says, I talked about how the structure of our aid has to change. Then number 4, we're talking about economic integration going forward. as the best arbiter of peace. And so 3 and 4 are interesting. Unfortunately, the Fox News host didn't ask him for follow-ups or more clarity on what he meant by number 3 and 4. My guess is that number 3 means, and he's referring to here, that Ukraine is going to have to give up some of its natural resources and mineral wealth to the United States if it wants any form of aid coming in the future. And while you would think that if there's an agreement to end the war, this would mean the end of USA going to Ukraine. I do think we could see some minimal arms shipments from the US going to Ukraine. Certainly not HIMARS or missiles, F-16s, Abrams tanks, armored personnel carrier, drones. All those will certainly be ruled out, but there may, Russia may be willing to bend on small arms or mortar artillery shells or something like that. I'm really not sure. I'm just kind of speculating there that Russia may be willing to give a little bit on the margins on that issue. And so maybe there will be some future U.S. military aid given to Ukraine. It just won't be in the billions and billions of dollars as we have seen over the past 3 years. Now, the second thing Ukraine is going to need is a lot of money to rebuild their destroyed infrastructure. And this is problematic. Russia's destroyed it. And so you may say, well, Russia should pay for it. And there may be some truth and morality to that. The simple fact is, in reality, they will not. And so if Ukraine wants to rebuild their country, they're going to need a lot of aid coming in from the outside. And that's going to be from their Western providers who are willing to give them hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons. And that aid is likely going, at least if it's come from the Trump administration, is going to be heavily dependent on Ukraine giving up its natural resources. Now, as we mentioned in that last piece, maybe number 4, when he says that we're talking about economic integration going forward as the best arbiter of peace, that he is referring to something negative in the sense of we could see U.S. soldiers deployed to areas of Ukraine where there's going to be economic integration, or the U.S. mining Ukraine's rare earth or taking their other natural resources. That would certainly fit into what Mike Waltz said in number 4. However, I think he's probably talking about here ending the Western sanctions on Russia and understanding that increasing the economic ties between the West and Moscow is the best way to ensure a lasting peace. And I do think if that's what he's talking about, he's absolutely correct. So those 4 points, I really do think could be a sign that we are moving in the right direction. That being said, it's not exactly clear what Waltz is talking about here. And we are talking about a fairly notorious war hawk. And so it may be that basically he's being vague to couch how interventionist his ideas really are. So, and again, Waltz suggested here, and other American officials have said this as well, that when we're talking about the U.S. gaining access to Kiev's rare earths or other natural minerals, it's at least mostly to repay the U.S. for previous aid sent. Now, from Kiev's perspective, there may be a lot of reason not to negotiate with that, and that's why I am a little bit concerned that when he's talking about the economics being the best arbiters of peace, maybe he is talking about sending American troops to Ukraine, because that is probably one thing I think Kiev would be willing to give up its rare earths for, is American troops being deployed to their country. So Waltz is expected to be a member of the American delegation that will speak with Russian officials next week in Saudi Arabia. It was interesting and notable that Waltz did not answer the Fox host's questions regarding whether or not Ukraine will be a party to the negotiations with Russia. Zelensky has said Kiev won't comply with any agreement that's negotiated without Ukrainians. In recent days, members of the Trump administration, including Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Pete Hegseth, have walked away from the hardline stance Washington took during the Joe Biden presidency. Hegseth suggested Kiev would not be admitted into NATO, describing the idea as unrealistic, which was good to see. So while there might be some good news when it comes to the war in Ukraine, it looks like we have all bad news when it comes to the Middle East today. Visiting Netanyahu, Rubio says Hamas must be eradicated. Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, February 16th. Speaking to reporters alongside Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem on Sunday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that Hamas must be eradicated, a goal that would require Israel to restart its genocidal war on Gaza. Hamas cannot continue as a military or government force, and frankly, as long as it stands as a force that can govern, or its force that can administer, or a force that can threaten by use of violence, peace becomes impossible. They must be eliminated. They must be eradicated, Rubio said. In remarks to the press, Netanyahu said he shared a common strategy on Gaza, including when the gates of hell will open if all Israeli hostages aren't released by Hamas, repeating a threat from President Trump. So Netanyahu said, I want to assure everyone who's now listening to us, President Trump and I are working in full cooperation and coordination between us. We have a common strategy, and we have always shared the details of this strategy with the public, including when the gates of hell would open, as they surely will be if all of our hostages aren't released until the last one of them. The Israeli leader mentioned President Trump's bold vision for Gaza, referring to his calls for the U.S. takeover of the Strip, which will involve an ethnic cleansing campaign. Netanyahu said he and Rubio discussed how we can work together to ensure that the future becomes a reality. Discussing Iran, Netanyahu said Israel had dealt a mighty blow to Iran's terror axis, and that with U.S. support, Israel could finish the job. While Rubio was visiting Israel, the Israeli defense minister announced that Tel Aviv has received a shipment of Mk-84 2,000-pound bombs from the U.S. That was paused by the Biden administration but then released by Trump. The Rubio-Netanyahu meeting came a day after Hamas released 3 Israeli hostages in exchange for 369 Palestinians being freed from Israeli jail. And this I covered for the antiwar.com on Saturday the 15th. Hamas releases 3 hostages, but Trump restates demand to release all of them. So following the release of 3 Israeli hostages, including 1 American, President Donald Trump restated his demand that all Israeli captives must be released from Gaza on Saturday. Trump wrote on Truth Social, Hamas has just released 3 hostages from Gaza, including an American citizen. They seem to be in good shape. This differs from their statement last week when they said they would not release any hostages. Israel will now have to decide what they will do about the 12 o'clock today deadline imposed to release all hostages. The United States will bet the decision they make. So Tel Aviv may view Trump's post as a green light to break the ceasefire and resume the onslaught in Gaza. The Israeli army chief said Saturday that it is his duty to bring everyone back, and the IDF is investing in many efforts for this purpose, and at the same time, we are preparing offensive plans. Trump is restating a threat he made Monday, where he said, if all the hostages aren't released by Saturday at 12 o'clock, I think that is appropriate time. I would say cancel it. All bets are off. Let hell break out. Trump issued the threat after Hamas said it would delay the hostage release scheduled for February 15th because Israel was not abiding by the ceasefire agreement. Since the deal went into effect on January 19th, Israel has killed around 100 Palestinians in Gaza. Additionally, Tel Aviv is not letting the amount of aid that was promised under the deal. Construction equipment to begin clearing debris, mobile home and tents were all pledged to be allowed into Gaza during the ceasefire and hostage deal. However, Israeli officials speaking with the New York Times confirmed Tel Aviv is not living up to its end of the deal. While it was Trump's envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, that pushed the hostage exchange and ceasefire deal across the finish line, Israel is now failing to comply with the agreement, and Hamas is continuing to release the hostages. It is unclear why Trump set Saturday as the deadline to release the hostages. Under the deal, captives on both sides were agreed to be released slowly under the first 2 phases of the agreement that would take several months. Last week, Trump appeared disturbed over the gaunt look of the Israeli hostages that were released by Hamas. While the American media and political class has focused on the status of the Israeli hostages, Palestinian detainees have also been released in health and have additionally been subject to severe beatings. One of the Palestinians released on Saturday told Al Jazeera that Israelis told us, "Welcome to hell. It was hell. From the first day, we were badly beaten. The beatings were brutal, tough, and unbearable." Israel has also harassed the free Palestinians and their families. Shortly after the release on Saturday, Israeli forces raided the homes of one of the freed men. All right, next up, this article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on February 16th. Israeli forces deliberately dismantled healthcare system in northern Gaza. So, humanitarian aid workers said the healthcare facilities in northern Gaza have been decimated by the Israeli onslaught. Starting in October, Israel began the systematic destruction of all structures in 3 northern Gaza cities. So, MSF, Medical Sans Frontiers, or Doctors Without Borders, emergency coordinator Caroline Shiguin explained the situation in northern Gaza. She said, "The level of destruction is total. It's flat land. I've never seen anything like it in my life. Our Palestinian colleagues are no longer able to recognize their own neighborhoods. Some of them were in shock, others collapsed. In Gaza City, we were already shocked by the level of destruction, but when we went north to Jabalia and we couldn't say a word, there was nothing anymore, only ruins and the smell of death everywhere because of the dead bodies still trapped under the rubble." When asked about the medical system, she explained that one hospital was utterly destroyed and the remaining healthcare facilities were operating at partial capacity. She noted that there was effectively no healthcare system remaining in northern Gaza. So, this is her statement. "There's no healthcare system anymore in the northern part of Gaza. Kamal Adwan Hospital has been razed, while Al-Shifa, Al-Adwan, and the Indonesia hospitals are seriously damaged and only operating at partial functioning. We were utterly shocked to observe that in the Indonesian hospital, every medical machine seemed to have been deliberately destroyed. They were smashed to pieces one by one to make sure no medical care could be provided anymore." Throughout the war on Gaza, aid agencies and doctors have frequently complained about Israeli attacks on hospitals, as well as the kidnapping of doctors and other medical staff. The Doctors Without Borders official said, "Even as Gaza is currently under ceasefire, there is not enough aid reaching the people in northern Gaza." She explained, "We are still not seeing the massive scale up in humanitarian assistance needed in northern Gaza. The humanitarian community is failing to provide the essential services to the people in dire need of humanitarian and medical support." As a part of the ceasefire deal, Israel agreed to let hundreds of aid trucks into Gaza each day. However, Tel Aviv has failed to meet the requirements set out in the agreement, which is unsurprising. And this, combined with the next few stories we're talking about, is really just goes to show how, again, Israel is trying to make life for the Palestinians as humiliating, as awful, as deadly as possible, so they are all forced to leave their homeland. Netanyahu said this over the weekend. I thought it was interesting, saying they call Gaza the world's largest open-air prison. That's not true. For all I care, the Palestinians could leave any time. Now, of course, he doesn't mean they could leave Gaza and return to their historic homes and villages in what is now Israel. No, he means they could leave and go to Israel, Egypt, or somewhere else, to probably go rot and die in the desert for what he wants. All right, this next story, one of the more horrific things that I've read about the situation in Gaza, as at least like a one-off anecdotal story. So, Israeli soldiers used 80-year-old as human shield before killing him and his wife. So, a senior Israeli officer in Gaza tied an explosive around the neck of an 80-year-old Palestinian man to force him to act as a human shield. And the man and his wife were later killed by Israeli soldiers. The Israeli media outlet, The Hottest Place in Hell, has reported. Israeli soldiers present at the scene told the media outlet that the incident occurred in May of 2024 in Gaza City Zetron neighborhood. Israeli soldiers soldiers found an elderly couple in their home who said they didn't evacuate due to mobility issues. One of the soldiers said they had nowhere to run and that they couldn't evacuate to Khan Yunis. The man was walking with a cane. They said they simply wouldn't be able to walk all the way there. The Israeli soldiers then separate the man from his wife and tied an explosive to him, threatening that his head would be blown off if he tried to run away, even though he had a cane. So one of the soldiers said they explained to him that if he did anything wrong or not as we wanted, the person behind him would pull the rope and his head would be severed from his body. He walked around with us like that for 8 hours, even though he was an 80-year-old man and even though he couldn't escape us. After the 8 hours of checking for explosives, the man was returned to his wife. Then Israeli soldiers ordered the elderly couple to evacuate to the south on foot. The report said the soldiers didn't inform other nearby battalions that the couple was heading south, and after they were walking for 100 meters, they were shot and killed. A soldier said after 100 meters, a second battalion saw them and shot them on the spot. They died like that in the street. And now this just goes to show how the open kill order is on any Palestinian in Gaza, right? We have here an 80-year-old couple, an old man walking with a cane. So clearly somebody who is not a threat, right? This person cannot possibly pose a threat. And yet they were just shot and killed for absolutely no reason, simply because part of the Israeli policy here is to thin out the population in Gaza. And again, make the situation so horrific for Palestinians that they all decide that it would be better to leave than to stay in Gaza. And if the Palestinians resist, well, that means killing them all. So the Israeli media has previously revealed that the IDF has an open fire policy in many areas of Gaza, meaning any Palestinian who entered it would be shot, even if they were unarmed civilians, or in this case, elderly people walking with a cane in the direction of the Israeli soldiers. Haaretz has reported that the unarmed civilians who are killed would be counted as terrorists. So the practice of using Palestinians as human shields has become widespread in Gaza, so much so that the Israelis gave it a name. Palestinians detained in Gaza and used as human shields are called mosquitoes, while Palestinians brought in from Israel for that purpose are called wasps. The hottest place in hell referred to the use of 80-year-old Palestinian man as a human shield as mosquito procedure. While the IDF claims it doesn't allow the use of Palestinians as human shields, a soldier said it had become official policy. So the soldier explained to the outlet, the mosquito procedure is fully institutionalized and it's a very gray area within the army. It's something that comes down as an explicit order from the battalion commander level and below, but somewhere at the bridge commander level, they completely deny it. When the problems start, they push responsibility downwards and say, don't do it. But in reality, they are giving the green light to do it, and it's happening. All right, next up here. Israeli strikes in Gaza killed 3 police officers despite ceasefire. So an Israeli drone strike on Sunday killed 3 Palestinian police officers east of the southern Gaza city of Rafah in a violation of the ceasefire agreement. The Interior Ministry said that the policemen had been in the area to secure the shipments of aid entering Gaza. So the ministry condemns this crime and calls upon the mediators and the international community to compel the occupation to stop targeting the police force, which is a civil apparatus and is needed to make sure the aid gets to its intended destination. Hamas has also released a statement condemning the strike. The treacherous firing carried out by the Zionist drone this morning east of the city of Rafah, targeting police elements tasked with securing the entry of aid, is considered a serious violation of the ceasefire agreement. One of the things that Israel has been doing throughout the conflict is they've been targeting the police force in Gaza that was there escorting the aid around Gaza, making sure it got to the humanitarian sites. That way it could be distributed to the people most in need. However, Israel has not only targeted the police force, but has also propped up and allowed Palestinian gangs to operate in areas where the IDF is present. And so they have been able to loot aid trucks. And so this is just another way to make sure that even the small amount of aid that's getting into Gaza never makes it to its intended destination. So next up here, this article that I wrote for antiwar.com on February 14th, Lancet, life expectancy in Gaza halved in first year of Israeli onslaught. So a new study found the average life expectancy in Gaza was nearly cut in half during the first year of the Israeli operations in Gaza. Tens of thousands of children have been killed in the bombing. So the paper, published by the prominent British medical journal The Lancet, found life expectancy in the Gaza Strip decreased by 34.9 years during the first 12 months of the war, about half, or 46%, of the pre-war level of 75.5 years. Life expectancy losses were larger for males at 38 years, or 51%, than for females, but nonetheless, females suffered large losses, 30 years, or 38%. The authors say they only use data from those who were directly killed in the conflict and not indirect deaths. Often, indirect deaths exceed those directly killed in the war, and the authors predict the decrease in life expectancy is higher than what is showed in the analysis of the direct death data. So the report says, our approach to estimating life expectancy losses in this study is conservative, as it ignores the indirect effect of the war on mortality. Even ignoring these indirect effects, results show that the ongoing war in the Gaza Strip generated a life expectancy loss of more than 30 years during the first 12 months of the war, nearly halving pre-war levels. Actual losses are likely to be higher. The life expectancy in Gaza has dropped significantly over the past year. It is unsurprising, as the horrific tactics deployed by Israel has often targeted children. During the war, Israel used a program called Where's Daddy? Under the program, Tel Aviv waited till suspected Hamas fighters were at their homes to bomb them, often killing entire families. Additionally, American doctors who worked in Gaza during the Israeli genocide have reported that Palestinian children are often targeted by Israeli snipers. A group of British doctors later issued a similar statement. And so again, that just makes it all very unsurprising. And again, this is all, I believe, a part of the genocide, the ethnic cleansing campaign, policies that are specifically intended to be atrocities and to scare the Palestinians into leaving, to agreeing that, life is too much hell, like Donald Trump says, that life will become too unbearable in Gaza, that every single person will leave, or be killed, and that's what Israel wants. And look, we already know the death toll is absolutely massive, probably well into the hundreds of thousands at this point. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up Conflicts of Interest for today, but don't worry, there will be another episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show out later today, 4:45. Dave DeCamp will be joining me, so be sure to tune into that. I will tweet out the live stream before we go live, but the best thing to do is head on over to YouTube, follow the page. It is the first link in the show notes, so very easy to find, and subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. Also, if you're still listening, it probably means you really like the show. If you want the show to keep happening and want me to be able to keep doing all the work that I'm doing, head on over to the Libertarian Institute and donate today. Thanks, everyone.